Most people run from their ghosts. I ran toward a place I hoped was full of them. It seemed like the only way to drown out the one that followed me. His name was Leo, my brother, and he was not a gentle memory. He was the splinter of ice I'd feel slide down my spine in the middle of a warm July afternoon. He was the phantom scent of dry desert dust that would suddenly fill my small city apartment, a place that hadn't seen a speck of real dirt in years. He was a constant, corrupted echo in the quiet moments, a whisper right beside my ear. "Elara Bear," he'd say, the old nickname twisting into something monstrous. "Remember the devil's backbone? You almost fell." The voice wasn't his, not really. It had the shape of his words, the cadence of his speech, but it was hollow, as if recorded and played back through a mile of waterlogged pipe. It was wrong. Every syllable was a desecration of the brother I'd loved, the brother who had died in a place that smelled exactly like that phantom dust. For 6 months, I'd lived with this presence. I'd tried priests and therapists, sage and salt lines. Nothing worked. Leo, or the thing wearing his memory, was tethered to me. My home had become a cage I shared with a tormentor, so when I saw the ad taped to a dusty gas station window on a desperate late-night drive, it didn't feel like a choice. It felt like a summons. Night attendant, Waypoint Station. Experience with loss required. That was it. No phone number, just a set of hand-drawn directions to a place that didn't seem to exist on any map. Waypoint Station. It was a last resort, a final desperate gamble to escape the ghost in my own home by running to a place that seemed to promise others. The station itself was a study in desolation. A single, squat building cast in the sickly yellow glow of a buzzing neon sign, surrounded by an ocean of cracked asphalt and, beyond that, an endless, featureless desert. It was a liminal space, caught between the highway and the horizon, between somewhere and nowhere. The woman who owned it, Agnes, didn't interview me. She assessed me. She sat behind a worn linoleum counter, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, her eyes the color of a stormy sky. They didn't just look at me. They seemed to be reading the frayed edges of my soul. She didn't ask about my work history or my references. She just watched me for a long, silent minute, the only sounds the hum of the beverage cooler and the frantic beating of my own heart. Then she asked her one and only question. Her voice was like gravel and smoke. "Why can you hear them?" She didn't ask if, she asked why. The question struck me with the force of a physical blow. It was a validation and a terror all at once. All the months of doubting my sanity, of fearing I was truly breaking, evaporated in that single, knowing question. I didn't have an answer. I just looked at her, the truth of my haunting probably written all over my face. A slow, grim nod was her only reply. "You'll do," she said, as if confirming a diagnosis. She didn't offer me a contract or an employee handbook. Instead, she slid a heavy, leather-bound notebook across the counter. It was ancient, the cover worn smooth and the corners protected by tarnished brass fittings. It felt impossibly heavy in my hands, radiating a faint, inexplicable cold. "The hours are sundown to sunrise," Agnes stated, her gaze fixed on the book in my hands. "You'll get visitors. Some are just lost, some are something else. This book has the rules." I opened it. The pages were thin as onion skin, filled with spidery, frantic handwriting that changed every few pages, as if written by dozens of different hands over countless years. I saw numbered lists, frantic warnings, and stark, terrifying diagrams. "These aren't for customer service," Agnes continued, her voice dropping lower, pulling my attention from the book's cryptic contents. She leaned forward, her stormy eyes pinning me in place. "They aren't suggestions. They are for containment. They are for survival." My blood ran cold. I looked past her, out the plate glass window into the encroaching darkness. The desert wasn't empty. It was waiting. I had come here to escape one ghost, but I was beginning to understand that I had just signed up to manage a legion of them. Agnes tapped a withered finger on the cover of the book. "You learn the rules, Elara, or the things that wander in from that dark will teach them to you. And you won't like their lessons." The station at night is a world suspended in amber light and profound silence. The first few hours of my shift were spent in a state of suspended dread, my senses stretched to their breaking point. I cleaned counters that were already spotless and restocked shelves that were already full, my eyes flicking constantly to the heavy, leather-bound book beside the register. My fingers traced the first entry, written in a tight, elegant script that belied its terrifying message. Rule number 1, check their reflections. Always. I had assumed it was a simple test of presence, a quick, supernatural litmus test, reflection, human, no reflection, ghost. I thought I understood. I was a fool. Just after midnight, the bell over the door chimed, a sound so sudden and sharp in the oppressive quiet that I nearly jumped out of my skin. He looked ordinary enough, a young man, maybe a few years older than me, with sun-bleached hair and lips so chapped they were cracked. His hiking clothes were faded and torn, and he moved with a weary, dragging gait. A lost hiker, just as Agnes had said. "Water," he rasped, his voice thin and dry, like dead leaves skittering across pavement. "Please, I just need some water." "Of course," I said, my own voice tight. My training, my instincts, screamed at me to get him a bottle from the cooler. But Agnes's voice echoed in my head, a low and smoky warning. "Learn the rules, or they will teach them to you." My heart hammered against my ribs as I forced my gaze away from him and toward the large, convex security mirror mounted in the corner of the ceiling. What I saw there will never leave me. There was no empty space where he should have been. It was so much worse. The mirror showed me the hiker, but it showed me his truth. His reflection was on its back, in a sun-scorched ravine, body convulsing in the throes of a final, agonizing dehydration. The skin on its face was pulled taut over the bone, cracking open like dried mud. Its eyes were wide, bulging with a terror that transcended life and death, its mouth stretched open in a silent, looping scream that I could feel in my own lungs. I watched the last, shuddering spasms of his life play out in a perfect, soundless loop of pure agony. I tore my eyes away, gasping, a cold sweat breaking out across my forehead. The man at my counter was just standing there, waiting patiently, his expression placidly desperate. He had no idea of the horror show playing out in his name just a few feet above his head. He was trapped in the moment of his death, and the mirror was the only thing that could see it. "The water," he repeated, his voice devoid of any echo, as if the sound was being swallowed by the air before it could touch a wall. I fumbled for a bottle, my hand shaking so badly I could barely twist the cap. He drank it down in one long, desperate pull, though not a drop seemed to truly wet his lips. When he finished, he reached into his pocket and placed his payment on the counter. They weren't dollars. They were 3 heavy, stone-like discs, cool and dense to the touch, caked with sand and time. The images on them were worn smooth, a sheaf of wheat on one, the profile of a forgotten president on another. They made a dull, heavy clack on the linoleum. Before I could react, Agnes emerged from the back room. She moved with a calm that felt ancient and absolute. She didn't even glance at the mirror. "You're on the wrong road, son," she said gently. "The one you're looking for is out back. It's called The Crossing." The hiker looked at her, his eyes clearing with a flicker of understanding, of relief. He gave a single, solemn nod, turned, and walked through the back door into the impenetrable desert night. Agnes swept the strange coins from the counter into a large glass jar already filled with hundreds of similar, time-worn payments. "Every soul that passes through leaves a piece of their story behind," she explained, seeing the question in my eyes. "It's the toll." She held the jar out to me. "Go on. Touch one." Hesitantly, I reached in, and my fingers brushed against a thick, grimy coin near the top. The station, the light, the silence, it all vanished. I wasn't in the Waypoint anymore. I was standing in a field of withered stalks, under a brassy, unforgiving sky. The grit of fine dust coated my tongue in the back of my throat. The air was hot, thick, and smelled of failure. A wave of suffocating panic washed over me, not my panic but someone else's. It was the desperate terror of a Dust Bowl farmer watching his world turn to powder, the gut-wrenching certainty that his family would not survive the winter. The feeling was so potent, so complete it nearly brought me to my knees. I snatched my hand back as if I'd been burned, the vision vanishing as quickly as it came. I stood panting, my hand trembling. Agnes looked at me, her expression grim. "You don't just see the memories, Elara, you feel them. Every soul that comes through that door is carrying its own hell inside it. The rules exist to make sure they don't leave it behind for you." The ghost of the hiker's agony clung to me long after he was gone. I could still feel the phantom burn of a waterless death in the back of my throat. I tried to focus, turning the brittle pages of the rulebook, my hands still unsteady. The next entry was written in a panicked, looping scrawl, as if the author was being pursued as they wrote. Rule number 2, never let them see today's newspaper. It seemed so mundane, so absurdly simple after the soul-flaying horror of the security mirror. A newspaper? What harm could a piece of paper do? I glanced at the stack of day-olds Agnes kept by the register, their headlines about stock fluctuations and distant political squabbles seeming utterly powerless in this place. My skepticism was a fragile shield, and it was about to be shattered. The chime of the door was softer this time, more hesitant. A woman stood there, blinking in the station's yellow light. She wore a pale blue waitress uniform with a starched white apron, the kind I'd only ever seen in old movies. Her hair was perfectly coiffed, and a pair of cat-eye glasses were perched on her nose. She looked profoundly and utterly lost. "Excuse me, miss." Her voice was polite, laced with a faint southern accent and a tremor of anxiety. "I hope I'm not a bother, but do you have a paper? Today's paper?" I felt Agnes's presence before I saw her. She had stepped out from the back room and was standing perfectly still, her stormy eyes fixed on the newcomer. It was all the warning I needed. "I'm sorry, ma'am," I said, my voice sounding thin to my own ears. "We're all out for the day." The woman's polite smile faltered. Her hands twisted the fabric of her apron. "Oh, but I really need one. I have to know about my Robert, my son." Her voice cracked, the carefully constructed composure beginning to fray. "He was serving overseas. He was supposed to be coming home soon. I need to check the casualty lists to make sure his name isn't there." A wave of pity so strong it was dizzying washed over me. I could feel the raw, desperate hope radiating from her, a mother's love stretched across time and space. But before I could soften, she saw them. Her eyes darted past me and locked onto the stack of newspapers on the counter. She took a step forward, her gaze fixed on the bold, modern date printed at the top of the page. Her face went slack with confusion. "No," she whispered, her brow furrowed. That's not right. That can't be the date." And then it began. The air in the station thickened, and a scent, so warm and comforting it was jarring, filled my lungs. Cinnamon and freshly baked apples, the phantom aroma of a perfect pie cooling on a windowsill. But it was instantly corrupted, twisted by a cloying sweetness that followed, the foul perfume of funeral flowers left to wilt on a grave. A bag of flour on a low shelf tore itself open, not with a gentle spill, but with a violent puff of white that revealed a squirming black heart of weevils. Across the room, a wire basket of shiny red apples began to wither before my eyes. In seconds their skin puckered, turned a bruised mottled brown, and then they launched themselves from the basket, one by one, splattering against the far wall like putrid grenades. I stared in horror at the woman, Doris Mayfair. Her form had begun to stutter, like a failing projection. One moment, she was the young, terrified waitress from the 1960s. The next, her form flickered, and I saw a thing of desiccated horror. Skin like dried leather pulled taut over a skeletal frame, her eye sockets black and hollow. the cat-eye glasses perched precariously on a bare skull. She was flickering between life and undeath, her grief literally tearing her apart. "No, no, no," she moaned, the sound a layered chorus of a young woman's sob and a skeleton's dry rattle. Just as the decay threatened to overwhelm her completely, Agnes stepped forward. She moved with an unnerving calm, holding a folded, yellowed piece of paper in her hand. "Doris," she said, her voice firm but gentle. "A letter came for you. It's from Robert." The flickering form froze. Its attention, both the living and the dead parts of it, snapped to the letter in Agnes's hand. Agnes unfolded it and began to read, her voice a steady anchor in the swirling chaos. "He's all right, Doris. His tour was extended. He's safe. He sends his love and says he'll be home before you know it." As Doris absorbed the words, a profound change occurred. The violent flickering slowed, then stopped. The skeletal horror receded like a fading shadow, leaving only the young waitress, her face streaked with tears of pure, unadulterated relief. She reached out with a trembling hand and took the fabricated letter, clutching it to her chest as if it were a holy relic. "He's safe," she whispered to herself. Without another word, she turned and walked to the back of the station, disappearing through the door that led to the crossing. I stood shaking amidst the wreckage of rotten apple pulp and infested flour. "That was a lie," I breathed, staring at Agnes. Agnes was already grabbing a broom. "The truth would have annihilated her," she said, not looking at me. "The shock of 50 lost years, of a son long dead. It doesn't just break their spirit, Elara. It turns their grief into a physical, destructive force, a storm that can tear this place apart." She finally looked at me, her eyes dark with ancient knowledge. A soul consumed by that kind of violent sorrow becomes a beacon. It screams into the void, and things far worse than a sad waitress will answer that scream. Sometimes, the kindest thing we can offer is a gentle deception. It's better than letting them become a monster. The mess from Doris Mayfair's shattered reality was a visceral reminder of Agnes's words. Grief was a weapon here. It could curdle the air and rot fruit from the inside out. As I swept up the last of the foul-smelling debris, I turned my attention back to the book, a growing sense of dread coiling in my stomach. The next rule was written in a different hand, a stark, forceful script that spoke of grim experience. Rule number 3, only tell them about the crossing. It was an instruction of omission, a warning about what not to say. It felt different from the others, less about managing a lost soul's agony, and more like a defense against an outside threat. I didn't have to wait long to find out what that threat was. The bell above the door chimed with a dead, hollow sound. A policeman stood there, his uniform immaculate, his posture ramrod straight. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and had a smile that was trying far too hard to be reassuring. My first instinct was relief, a figure of authority, a piece of the normal world intruding on this pocket of madness. But then I looked closer. The skin on his face was stretched too tight, like canvas pulled over a poorly made frame. It had a waxy, artificial sheen under the station's lights. When he moved his head, his neck bent just a fraction too far, a subtle joint-popping motion that was deeply, fundamentally wrong. Everything about him was a near-perfect copy of a human being, but the small imperfections were horrifying. "Good evening," he said. His smile widened, and the skin at the corners of his mouth tore, just a little, revealing not flesh and blood, but a glimpse of absolute, lightless blackness within. "I'm looking for someone. A young man, a hiker, name of Thomas Weaver, went missing a few days ago. We believe he may have wandered this way." His voice was the worst part. It wasn't one voice. It was a chorus, a low, horrifying amalgamation of faint, terrified whispers, all speaking in unison to form a single, coherent sound. I could almost pick out individual threads of terror within it, a child's whimper, an old woman's plea, a man's last, gasping breath. It was the sound of 100 stolen voices, forced to speak for their captor. This was what the rule was for, a hunter, a collector, The very air in the station grew heavy and charged, smelling of ozone and old, dried blood. The lights overhead didn't just flicker. They seemed to weep, dripping a thick, black, oily substance that sizzled and vanished before it hit the floor. I glanced at the round clock on the wall. Its second hand was ticking steadily, unnervingly, backward. I haven't seen anyone like that, I stammered, my mouth dry. I could feel the entity's focus sharpen, its gaze pressing down on me like a physical weight. "Are you certain?" the policeman asked, taking a step closer. As he did, one of his knees bent at an angle no human knee could achieve, the joint moving with a sickening fluid click. Beneath the taut fabric of his uniform pants I saw something dark and liquid shift, a ripple under the skin that was not muscle. He would be very lost, very afraid. We just want to help him find his way. The whispers in its voice grew more distinct, a symphony of suffering that threatened to overwhelm my senses. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. I knew, with chilling certainty, that the way this thing offered did not lead to peace. "He's not here," a voice cut through the charged air. Agnes stood beside the counter, her face set like stone. In her hand, she held a strange object, something I hadn't seen before. It looked like a compass, but its needle was a shard of obsidian that spun wildly, not pointing north, but aimed directly at the policeman. "This one is not for you, Collector," Agnes said, her voice ringing with an authority I hadn't heard before. The policeman's smile vanished. The human facade wavered. "The Waypoint cannot shelter every stray keeper. You know the rules." "I know my rules," Agnes retorted, taking a step forward. "And my rule says you are not welcome here." As she advanced, the obsidian needle on her compass glowed with a faint internal light. The Collector flinched back as if struck. For a split second, the disguise shattered. The policeman's form dissolved into a roiling, writhing mass of shadows and grasping limbs, a vortex of hungry, disembodied eyes, all focused on Agnes with pure, undiluted hatred. The chorus of whispers became a unified shriek of rage that vibrated through the floor. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the human form snapped back into place. The policeman gave Agnes a look of cold fury, the torn corners of his mouth twitching. Without another word, it turned, its movements stiff and unnatural, and strode out into the desert night. I leaned against the counter, my legs feeling like water. What was that?" "A collector," Agnes said, her voice grim as she watched the darkness where the entity had disappeared. "They're parasites. They feed on lost souls, on their hope and their fear, before consuming them entirely. They hunt on the fringes, and this station is the most fertile hunting ground there is." She turned to me, her stormy eyes filled with a new, somber light. "They are the reason the crossing is our most important secret. It's the only path we can offer. Everything else is just a trap laid by them." The encounter with the Collector left a greasy film of dread in the air, a residue that clung to the corners of the station long after its reality-warping presence had faded. The clock on the wall had resumed its proper course, but I couldn't shake the feeling that time itself had been bruised. I retreated to the rulebook, no longer as a wary student, but as a soldier studying a combat manual. The next laws weren't just about containment. They felt like protocols for managing cataclysm. The script changed again, this time to a slanted, desperate scrawl. Rule number 4. If they come in groups of 3, don't let them separate. The warning was stark, absolute. It offered no explanation, which only made it more terrifying. I didn't have to wonder for long. The bell chimed, not with one distinct ring, but with a discordant jangle, as if struck 3 times in perfect, jarring unison. 3 teenagers walked in. They all wore identical high school Letterman jackets, the felt faded and stained with something dark. They moved with an unnerving synchronicity, their steps falling in the exact same rhythm, their heads turning at the same instant. It wasn't practiced, it was instinctual, as if they were 3 limbs of a single, hive-mind organism. One was headed for the drinks cooler, another for the snack aisle, the third toward the front door as if to stand guard. A cold knot of dread formed in my stomach. Don't let them separate. Stop! The word tore from my throat, louder and sharper than I intended. All three of them froze, their heads snapping toward me in perfect, eerie unison. Their faces were blank masks of youthful indifference, but their eyes held a shared, predatory emptiness. "Station policy," I blurted out, my mind racing for a plausible lie. "Everyone in a group has to stay together at the counter, inventory control." It was a flimsy excuse, but it seemed to be enough. With a shared silent sigh that seemed to emanate from all three at once, they regrouped, their shoulders almost touching as they shuffled toward me. The one in the middle leaned forward, his vacant eyes scanning the shelves behind me. The air around them was unnaturally still, holding the faint, cloying scent of cheap cologne and something else, something like scorched earth. My gaze instinctively flickered up to the security mirror, my blood running cold with anticipation. I expected to see their moment of death, some tragic accident or violent end. But what I saw was not their story. It was their victims. For a horrifying, fleeting instant, the mirror showed me a vision from a place that could only be hell. I saw a brilliant, shimmering form, a human soul pure and radiant, being held down by three skeletal, shadowy entities. As I watched, paralyzed with horror, they tore it apart. They didn't just break it. They ripped it into three screaming pieces of light, each one pulling a third of the soul's essence away. I could feel the psychic shriek of that final, utter violation, a pain beyond death. It wasn't just murder, it was complete and utter annihilation. I gasped and looked away, my hand flying to my mouth. The teenagers at the counter just stared at me, their faces impassive. They weren't the souls of three dead boys. They were the entity that had devoured another. They were a single, ravenous predator wearing the faces of its first kill. Following Agnes's lead from before, I pointed a trembling finger toward the back door. "The crossing is that way." Without a word, they turned in unison and marched out into the night. I was still shaking when the next visitor arrived, an older woman. Her clothes tattered and ancient, her face a mask of frantic worry. She clutched a small, worn satchel and rushed to the counter, placing a handful of what looked like wilted herbs before me. "Please," she begged, her voice a frantic whisper, "for my daughter, she has the fever. I need the poultice." As she spoke, I saw the register next to me flicker to life on its own. The red digital numbers began to cycle backward, a blur of spinning digits. 1974, 1952, 1929. Then it stopped, settling on a date, 1692. A new rule, one I had read just moments before, screamed in my mind. Rule number 5. When the register shows impossible dates, close it. The woman, Clara Bell, reached for the herbs, trying to complete a transaction across 3 centuries of time. "Please, I must hurry." "No, wait." I slammed the register drawer shut. The no-sale key clicked with a deafening finality. The moment I did, Clara Bell's physical form convulsed. Her skin withered and cracked, her hair turned to white dust, and her body decayed into a skeletal husk right before my eyes. Then, just as quickly, it reformed, flesh knitting back over bone, her panicked expression returning. It happened again and again, a rapid, grotesque cycle of decay and rebirth tied to her impossible desire. She was a soul, caught in a time loop, tethered to her own torment. In her panic, she grabbed my wrist. It wasn't a cold touch. It was a searing, consuming frost that burned my skin. It wasn't just a physical sensation, it was an injection of pure despair. A century of her panicked, helpless grief flooded into me. The terror of the accusations, the horror of the trial, the cold dread of the gallows. I felt her unending, cyclical nightmare as if it were my own. I ripped my arm from her grasp, stumbling back. "Agnes!" I screamed, the single word all I could manage. The woman's burning, freezing despair was still racing through my veins, a poison of pure, undiluted regret. This place didn't just host the dead. It was a nexus for their deepest, most violent pains. The chilling phantom of Clarabelle's century of panic lingered in my bones, a cold reminder of how easily the past could poison the present. Each new soul felt like a new trial by fire, and the rulebook was my only shield. I forced myself to read on, my fingers tracing the faded ink of warnings left by those who had stood in this same spot, facing this same darkness. The rules were getting more specific, more bizarre, each one a scar from a battle I could only imagine. Rule number 6, don't dance to the music. As if on cue, a soft, scratchy tune began to drift from the old radio on a shelf behind the counter. It was a mournful, brassy jazz tune, full of lonely saxophones and a slow, hypnotic beat. I hadn't even realized the radio was plugged in. There was something underneath the music, though, a low, subliminal frequency that hummed at the very edge of hearing, making my teeth ache and the back of my neck prickle with a strange, nauseating dread. The door opened to admit a young soldier, his uniform crisp but his eyes hollow. He had the clean-cut look of a man from the 1940s, his gaze distant and unfocused. He didn't seem to see me at all. His attention was captured entirely by the music. A sad, slow smile touched his lips. "It's our song," he whispered to the empty air beside him. He began to move, his feet shuffling in a slow, clumsy box step. He wasn't just dancing. With every beat of the mournful tune, a grotesque transformation took hold. As his foot tapped down, the flesh on his hands withered, his skin pulling back from his cheekbones, his uniform decaying into rags. For a single horrific beat, he was a skeleton, grinning macabrely in the dim light. Then, as he lifted his foot for the next step, youth and life flooded back into him. His skin became smooth, his uniform immaculate, the young soldier returning for a fleeting moment before the next beat brought the decay again. He was trapped not in a single memory, but in the very process of his own undoing, a grotesque dance between life and undeath. He was a prisoner of the rhythm, his personal hell set to music. The rule wasn't a suggestion, it was a desperate warning. To join his dance would be to join his decay, to be ensnared in his horrifying cyclical death. I lunged for the radio and yanked the plug from the wall. The music cut out abruptly, and the soldier, Arthur, froze mid-step, the skeletal decay halting halfway across his face. He looked at me then, a glimmer of pained awareness in his one human eye, before he turned and shuffled out through the back, toward the crossing. The silence that followed was a relief, but it was short-lived. The next rule I read sent a fresh wave of ice through my veins. Rule number 7. They must not see the bathroom mirror. A bride appeared next, her white dress immaculate but for the dark, damp soil staining the hem. Her veil was askew, and her face was a mask of frantic, tear-streaked confusion. She looked around the station wildly, her eyes darting from the coolers to the shelves as if searching for an escape that wasn't there. "I can't. Where is he?" she sobbed, clutching a bouquet of dead brown roses. "He was right there. He was waiting for me at the altar." Before I or Agnes, who had appeared silently at my elbow, could speak, the bride's wild eyes found the small, unassuming door marked restroom. A look of desperate purpose crossed her face. "I have to fix my makeup," she declared, her voice unnaturally firm, as if she'd found a single, manageable task in an ocean of chaos. She rushed for the door and locked it behind her before I could even form a protest. We heard the faucet run, and then a scream. It was not a scream of terror, but of pure, soul-shattering self-recognition. It was the sound of a soul finally seeing not who she was, but what she had become. The scream was followed by a sharp cracking sound. Agnes and I rushed to the door, but it was locked fast. "Isabel!" Agnes yelled, rattling the knob. "Open the door!" There was no reply but a choked, gurgling sob. A thick, black, tar-like substance began to ooze from under the door. It smelled of wet earth and profound sorrow. It wasn't just a substance. It was her materialized regret, her despair made manifest. I peered through the keyhole and saw the bathroom mirror. It hadn't just cracked. It was weeping the same black tar, the viscous fluid pouring down its surface and pooling on the floor. Isabel was on her knees in the center of the room, the black ooze already swirling around her ankles, threatening to rise and drown her in her own sorrow forever. As Agnes threw her shoulder against the door, I fumbled through the book, my hands slick with sweat, searching for anything, any clue. My eyes landed on the final rule on the page. Rule number 8, never follow them to their unfinished business. At that exact moment, the front door chimed. A mail carrier stood there, dripping, not with rain, but with murky, foul-smelling river water that pooled around his feet. His mailbag, slung over his shoulder, was also dripping, and I could see phantom, skeletal fish swimming in and out of the ethereal, waterlogged fabric. He was not just wet, he was an avatar of a watery grave. "Special delivery," he gurgled, his voice thick with river mud. He looked directly at me. "For Elara. A letter from the other side. You just have to come and sign for it." He gestured, with a waterlogged hand, toward the front door, toward the dark highway. He wasn't just trying to finish his route. He was trying to pull me into the same dark, cold place where he had met his end. The choice was suddenly, brutally clear. Let the bride drown in her own despair, or follow the mail carrier to mine. The station was a vortex of converging nightmares. Behind me, a bride was drowning in her own materialized sorrow. Before me, a drowned man was beckoning me to a watery grave. The air was thick with the stench of river mud and regret. My heart hammered against my ribs, caught between two impossible, fatal choices. It was a test, I realized, a crucible designed to break me. Suddenly, a new figure stepped past the dripping mail carrier, moving with a chilling, predatory grace. It wore the desert camouflage of a soldier, the familiar pattern making my breath catch in my throat. Its face, it was the face of Sergeant Ramirez, one of the men from Leo's squad. I knew it from the photos, from the funeral, but like the policeman, the disguise was imperfect. The eyes were too still, the skin too waxy. It was a collector, wearing one of my most painful memories as a mask. "Elara," the collector said, its voice a sickening mimicry of Ramirez's respectful tone. It ignored the mail carrier, its attention fixed solely on me. I was with Leo. At the end, the world narrowed to the space between us. The sounds of the gurgling mail carrier and the weeping mirror faded into a dull roar. This wasn't a random haunt, this was a targeted attack. "He wasn't scared," the entity continued, its voice dropping to an intimate whisper. It took a step closer, and I could feel the cold radiating from it, a void-like chill that had nothing to do with temperature. "He asked me to tell you something," his last words. He said, "Tell Larabert the stars are brighter out here than we ever imagined." The words struck me with the force of a physical blow, stealing the air from my lungs. They were the exact, secret words Ramirez had relayed to me in a hushed, tearful phone call from halfway across the world. A phrase only he and I were supposed to know. A sacred, painful memory of my brother's last moments, now twisted into a psychological weapon, spilling from the mouth of this thing. It was the ultimate violation, turning my deepest grief into bait for its trap. "He's waiting for you, Elara," the collector whispered, its false face curving into a knowing smile. "Just a few steps outside. Come with me." It was a perfect, brutal cruelty. It offered me the one thing I craved more than anything, a connection to Leo, while dangling it over a pit of utter annihilation. "Get out!" a voice boomed, filled with an authority that shook the very foundations of the station. Agnes stood between me and the collector, her small frame radiating an immense, undeniable power. The strange compass was in her hand, its obsidian needle spinning like a furious hornet. "Your hunt is over for tonight," she snarled. The collector's disguise hissed, the face of Ramirez contorting in fury. "The Keeper's time is ending! We can feel it! We will have this place, and every soul you are hiding within it!" With a shriek of pure rage, the collector dissolved, retreating into the night. At the same moment, the mail carrier wavered and faded, his summons broken. Behind us, the sound of oozing tar from the bathroom ceased. Agnes turned to me, her face etched with a sorrow so profound it seemed ancient. "The surge in their activity, the targeted attacks. It's because my time is up, Elara. The crossing. It's finally calling me home." I stared at her, uncomprehending. "What do you mean?" "I wasn't always the Keeper," she said, her voice softer now, weary. 60 years ago I was a lost soul, just like them. My car broke down right out front. The Keeper before me offered me a choice: pass through the crossing or take his place. I chose this. She gestured to the small, lonely station around us. Now, the station has chosen you. As she spoke, a low howl began to rise from the desert outside. It wasn't the cry of a coyote. It was a unified, psychic shriek of a dozen, no, 100, collectors. They sensed the transfer of power, the moment of vulnerability. They were gathering. Through the plate glass window I could see them. Their human masks were melting away, revealing their true forms, writhing vortices of shadow and rage, things of grasping limbs and countless hungry eyes. They slammed against an invisible barrier that rippled around the station, the force of their assault shaking the walls and rattling the bottles on the shelves. Agnes ignored them. She took a small, tarnished pin from her pocket. It was a simple name tag, engraved with a single word: Keeper. "I'm not. I can't," I stammered, my voice trembling. "You can," Agnes said, her eyes meeting mine, "because you must." She reached out and pinned the tag to my shirt. The moment the pinprick pierced the fabric, a searing, white-hot agony erupted in my chest. It wasn't a physical pain. It was the violent, crushing weight of 60 years of knowledge, of every rule, every soul, every sorrow Agnes had ever shouldered, being forced directly into my mind. I felt the agony of 1,000 lost souls, the cold hunger of the collectors, the crushing loneliness of this post. The influx was a psychic tidal wave, and I screamed as it threatened to shatter my sanity, to scour my own identity from my mind and leave only the Keeper behind. The agony was a supernova in my mind, a universe of grief and responsibility exploding behind my eyes. For a timeless moment, I was Agnes. I was the man before her, and the Keeper before them, stretching back into an endless line of lonely sentinels. I felt their triumphs, their failures, and the crushing weight of their solitude. The memories of my own life, of Leo, of my apartment, of the girl who had desperately driven into the desert, felt like a single fading photograph in a vast, ancient album. When the searing torrent finally subsided, I was still standing, but I was no longer just Elara. The howling of the collectors outside reached a fever pitch. They clawed at the invisible barrier, their shadowy forms writhing in a frenzy of anticipation. They knew the moment of transition was complete. Agnes looked at me, and for the first time I saw the woman beneath the Keeper. I saw the young, lost soul from 60 years ago, her face now deeply etched with the burdens she had carried. A faint, peaceful smile touched her lips. "Thank you," she whispered. She turned and walked to the front door, pushing it open. The psychic shriek of the collectors intensified, but as Agnes stepped out onto the cracked asphalt, a profound silence fell. The horde of writhing shadows parted before her like water before a stone. They could not touch her. A Keeper answering the final call was sacrosanct, beyond their grasp. She didn't look back. She simply walked east, toward the faint pre-dawn glow on the horizon. With each step, her form grew brighter, less solid, until she dissolved into a soft, warm mote of light that drifted up into the nascent dawn, finally free. Then, the horde turned its collective, hungry gaze on me. They surged forward, the invisible barrier dissolving with Agnes's departure. They were a tidal wave of void and hunger, their unified shriek returning, aimed directly at me, designed to shred the sanity of the new, untested keeper. But the fear that should have paralyzed me was gone, replaced by a cold, quiet certainty. The 60 years of knowledge settled within me, not as a burden, but as a mantle of authority. I stood my ground behind the linoleum counter, the heart of the station, and I faced the oncoming darkness. I opened my mouth to speak, and the voice that emerged was not just my own. It was layered, resonant, carrying the echoes of every keeper who had come before me. It was a voice of absolute command. Leave. The single word was not a request, it was a decree. A tangible shockwave of power erupted from me, a ripple of force that slammed into the charging horde. The psychic shriek of the collectors turned into a chorus of pained howls as the wave of power hit them. They were physically hurled backward, their shadowy forms tumbling and dissipating like smoke in a hurricane. In seconds they were gone, flung back into the deepest shadows of the desert to lick their wounds. The station was quiet, utterly, profoundly quiet. The silence was heavier now, deeper. It was my silence. The sun began to cast its first long golden rays across the desert, signaling the end of my first night. My shift was over. I looked down at my hands, resting on the worn leather of the rulebook. They looked like my hands, but they felt different, imbued with a strength and a weariness that were not entirely mine. The bell over the door chimed softly. A young woman stood there, her eyes wide with fear and confusion, her clothes soaked from a rain that hadn't fallen in this desert for months. She was lost. She was the first of my flock. I drew a breath and stood up straighter, the mantle of the keeper settling fully onto my shoulders. The black book felt heavy and familiar in my hands. I was the new warden of this desolate place. I had found my purpose. I had run from my ghost only to become the guardian for 1,000 more. As I moved to greet the lost soul, to guide her toward the crossing, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the dark glass of the beverage cooler. It was still me, my face, my hair, my eyes. But then my gaze drifted to the wall behind the counter, where my silhouette was cast in the morning light. I froze. My shadow was no longer shaped like me. It was taller, thinner, its edges impossibly sharp. The angles of its shoulders and head were subtly, terrifyingly wrong, an alien silhouette mimicking my movements. It was the shadow of something ancient and unyielding. The Waypoint hadn't just given me a job or a purpose. It had claimed a part of my soul as payment, and my own shadow was the receipt, a permanent, silent reminder of the price of becoming the keeper at the crossroads at the edge of nowhere.